2 days before Christmas, the largest manhunt ever in the state of Texas occurred on December the 23rd, 1927, after a gang of men decided to rob the National Bank of CISCO, Texas. During this period in Texas, at least 4 banks a day were being robbed, forcing authorities to offer a $5,000 reward to anyone who would shoot a bank robber. In order to disguise himself, the head of the operation, Marshall Ratliff, wore a Santa Claus costume and planned what would seem to be an easy holdup. However, the robbery did not go as planned and would involve the law and civilians in a shootout and car chase with jolly old Saint Nick. Welcome to another Christmas edition of Shadow Matter, and today we're going to be talking about the crime blunder that is the Santa Claus bank robbery in CISCO, Texas. What seemed like an easy job for the gang of criminals soon turned disastrously wrong and ends in a fatal shootout and car chase. A truly bizarre case that also saw some of the men being sentenced to execution and pleading insanity, but more on that later. Our story begins with Marshall Ratliff. Marshall Ratliff was a career criminal from CISCO, Texas, who had been arrested and sent to prison by CISCO Chief of Police G.E. Bedford for a robbery he committed a few years earlier with his brother Lee Ratliff. Ratliff had been caught with his brother Lee after robbing a bank in Valera, and they had each served only a year of their sentences before being pardoned by Governor Miriam A. Ferguson. Interestingly, this pardon was one of the thousands of pardons granted by the governor, most likely due to suspicions that most of the concessions were bought. Upon his release from prison, Ratliff decided to revisit his hometown of CISCO, Texas, and brainstormed the notion of robbing the First National Bank of CISCO, deciding to enlist the help of his brother Lee. But unfortunately, he had been arrested again, so Marshall pulled a team of ex-cons together to help complete the job. Henry Helms and Robert Hill, whom he knew from Huntsville, and a fourth man who was good with safes. As they planned the crime in Wichita Falls, the safecracker came down with the flu, and the trio pulled in Lewis Davis, a family man in need, with the offer of big money. The 4 men stole a car in Wichita Falls and headed for CISCO. During this time in the late 1920s, Texas was facing a massive problem with bank robberies. It had been thought that on average, up to 3 or 4 banks a day were being robbed. The Texas Bankers Association offered a reward of $5,000 to any member of public who would kill a bank robber on sight. This made the aforementioned plan to rob the bank in CISCO a dangerous undertaking. Marshall Ratliff knew that he would be sighted immediately in CISCO, so the plan was for him to disguise his appearance. Having planned the robbery for late December, the original idea of dressing up as Santa Claus to avoid raising suspicion came into play. The plan was simple. Walk in, hold up the bank, get the money, and make a clean getaway. However, this simple plan would end in chaos and became one of the state's most bizarre cases. On the morning of December the 23rd, the gang arrived in CISCO in their stolen car and dropped Ratliff off, donning his Santa costume, several blocks away from the bank. Along the way, children ran up to Ratliff, excited to see Santa, but according to reports, Ratliff ignored them all. In an alley further up, Ratliff was joined by the other 3 men, and together they made their way into the bank. Ignoring greetings directed at Santa, Ratliff and the gang drew their guns, indicating it was a holdup. While the others covered the customers and employees, Ratliff grabbed money from the tellers and forced one to open the vault. A mother and daughter entered the bank during the holdup. Despite threats that the gang would shoot if she left the building, she quickly escaped with her daughter into a nearby alley and screamed for help. Alerted to screams, Chief of Police G.E. Bedford and a number of citizens made their way to the bank. While this was going on, Ratliff had filled his sack with money from the vault. Robert Hill noticed someone outside and fired a shot through the window. Immediately, a shot was returned. What follows is a shootout with the police, the gang, and seeing as most citizens owned guns in CISCO, the townspeople also. Desperate to make it out alive, the gang rounded up the people inside the bank and took them as hostages, forcing them outside and directing them to the criminal's stolen car. Several of these hostages were wounded as they emerged into the alley, including Alex Spears, the bank president. Most of the customers escaped. However, 2 small girls were taken as hostages. In a shootout in the alley, as the gang tried to get into their car, Chief Bedford and Deputy George Carmichael were mortally wounded. Bedford died several hours later, and Carmichael held on until the 17th of January. Marshall Ratliff and Lewis Davis were also wounded in the shootout, Davis severely. Making their way out of town, the gang realised that they were running short on gas, and also one of their tyres had been shot out during their escape. Coming across an Oldsmobile on the edge of town, and attempted to ditch their stolen car and commandeer the Oldsmobile, driven by a 14-year-old local boy. The boy obliged with the criminals' demands and gave them the car, but not the keys. The robbers transferred their things to the Oldsmobile in the midst of gunfire, which wounded Hill, only to realise that they could not start the car. Davis was by then unconscious, so they left him in the car and moved back to the first car with their two hostages. They did not realise, until later, that they had left the money that they had stolen with Davis. The mob found Davis and the money and temporarily gave up chase. The money was returned to the bank. They had stolen $12,400 in cash and $150,000 in non-negotiable securities. The struggling family man, Lewis Davis, died later that night at Fort Worth Hospital. Without the stolen money and having to abandon their bullet-ridden car along with their hostages, the remaining members of the gang made off on foot several miles outside of town. The next morning, they managed to steal another car and took the driver hostage for over 24 hours. The two wounded men, especially Ratliff, were doing very poorly due to their wounds, lack of food, and the icy sleeting conditions. Eventually, the threesome was ambushed by Sheriff Foster of Young County at South Bend as they tried to cross the Brazos River. Another car chase followed, with the shootout in a field as the three tried to make their escape. A Texas Ranger was involved in the firefight, and it is rumored he hit all three men. Ratliff was hit and fell to the ground. Helms and Hill were both wounded, but they managed to escape into the woods. Several days later, after dodging an intense manhunt assisted by an airplane, the two made it into Graham and were taken into custody by lawmen without a fight. Two more men would be wounded in the manhunt from accidental discharge of their weapons, bringing the total number of the wounded to 8, excluding the 3 surviving robbers. The gang of robbers had not eaten for days and were all severely wounded, but managed to live despite their health conditions and stand trial for their parts in the crime and the resulting deaths of the two lawmen. Robert Hill, pleading guilty to armed robbery, took the stand on his own behalf, and in March was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He escaped from prison 3 times, but was recaptured each time. After settling down, he was paroled in the mid-1940s, changed his name, and became a productive citizen. Henry Helms was identified as one of the men who had gunned down both lawmen, and was given the death sentence in late February. After an unsuccessful insanity plea, he was executed by electric chair on September 6, 1929. Marshall Ratliff, the so-called mastermind behind the failed heist, was at first only convicted of armed robbery in January of 1928 and sentenced to 99 years in prison. However, on March the 30th, he was tried again for his role in the deaths of the two lawmen, Bedford and Carmichael, and was sentenced to execution. Although no one could testify to seeing him actually fire a gun inside the bank, he appealed his case, but this ultimately failed. In a bizarre attempt, Ratliff then pleaded insanity and began acting insane the day that Henry Helms was executed. As seemingly convincing as he was, his jailers believed he was insane, and his mother even filed for a lunacy hearing in Huntsville, but the community of Eastland County were upset that Ratliff had not been executed yet. Ratliff was issued a bench warrant for an armed robbery charge for stealing a car and then extradited to Eastland County Jail. There, Ratliff convinced his jailers he was really insane, and they had to wash, feed, and take him to the toilet. On November the 18th, Ratliff attempted an escape and mortally wounded one of his jailers in the process. The very next day, the aggravated locals, unsatisfied with the turn of events, demanded the execution of Ratliff and formed a lynching mob. They stormed the prison and overpowered Ratliff's jailers and dragged him out. They tied his hands and feet and headed for a nearby power pole. The first attempt to hang him failed when the knot came loose and he fell to the ground. The second time, however, the knot did not come undone. Ratliff was pronounced dead at 9:55 p.m. on November the 19th, 1929. The jailer that Ratliff had hurt had died that evening, bringing the total number of dead including 3 bank robbers, to 6. No one was ever tried for the lynching of Ratliff despite a grand jury being formed. The body of Marshall Ratliff was put on a macabre display in a furniture store where over 7,000 people viewed it. A judge ordered the corpse locked up and it was returned to the Ratliff family. Today, there is a medallion commemorating the Santa Claus bank robbery in CISCO, Texas. This will be the last video on Shadow Matter for 2023, and I will be taking a break over the holidays. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video and wish you all a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. See you in early 2024. Cheers. Have a good one.